Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you maybe in other parts of the country where it is still morning. Welcome to this session on understanding social media risks. We'll be kicking off in about another minute or two. We'll just wait a moment for anyone who might still be getting themselves organised, logging on, maybe eating some lunch or a cup of tea. So please just sit back, take a moment, and we'll be starting in just a moment or two. Thank you. Okay, we'll get started. It's a couple of minutes past our official starting time. So welcome to everyone who has joined us. Thank you for joining us on this session talking about your social media risks. This is an incredibly important area, I think, for any business owner or any professional to be thinking about. So I do commend you for joining a webinar that isn't, I guess, some of the typical focus of some of the education that a lot of health professionals undertake. I think quite often the focus is on your clinical skills and understanding sort of that clinical and technical knowledge that you need, which is incredibly important. But it's also important for every professional out there to understand the other sorts of risks that can impact you when potentially running a business or if you're an employee. And this is a really growing risk that is continually changing all the time in terms of how we use social media and the impact it has on us. So I do commend you for joining this session. What I would encourage you as we go through today's session is to really stop and think about your own social media use. I think it's very easy as we look at a topic like this to sometimes think, oh, look, I sort of know, the key things. I know not to do really dumb stuff when I'm using social media. However, when I show you some examples today, it really is sometimes quite surprising what some people do when they're maybe not fully thinking about the implications, when maybe they're rushing to just share a post. Particularly in your private life, we often don't put a lot of thought into our social media posts. So it's very easy, I think, to fall into some of those little traps that are out there. So I'd really encourage you to think about yourselves and your day-to-day use of both your professional and your personal social media use, but also think about any of your colleagues, whether you employ staff or anyone working with you or for you. Think about their social media use as well and what they understand, because as you'll see as we go through some of this information, what they do can also impact you and your business and your reputation. So please come into this with an open mind about what can go wrong and really think about your use and what maybe you need to make some changes, what areas you need to make some changes in going forward with social media. So starting off, what we'll be covering today is really just looking at what is social media use and how we use it. I'm going to give you some examples that are out there in the public domain around some common, really sort of social media fails, I guess I'm calling them. So where people have gone wrong and where that's had some pretty negative implications for them. And then we'll be finishing off with some tips for you in terms of your safe social media use. So I really have a strong view here at Guild when I run these sorts of education sessions. I want you to walk away from this session with some really clear practical tips that you can apply in your use and really apply to how you're using social media and how your business is using social media. So first bit here is, what is social media? Social media is something we all know about, but often we don't sort of sit back and reflect on it. So it's really just any sort of use of any tool where you're sharing a huge amount of information online with a number of different people. As you can see by the examples I've got there on screen, social media can be, it's a really broad term because there are so many different sorts of platforms out there. So it almost can be anything that we're using to share information online. All those different examples there online for you show just how much variety there is out there. All these different sorts of platforms do slightly different things and operate in different ways, and we often use them for different sorts of purposes and for different reasons. That's a great thing in that you've got options out there in terms of what it is you want to do, what will work best for you, and which platform you want to use. But at the same time, I think that can create some risks for you and some challenges. Sometimes it's hard to get your head around all those different sorts of platforms, how they operate, then if they make changes to them, what you need to do to keep up with those sorts of changes. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today, we'll be talking about the benefits of it, but there's the risks you need to balance. And that's a really core part of social media. So there is a lot out there that's fantastic for you, but sometimes having so much out there will create those risks. So when you're using social media, there's two types of social media use that you need to be careful of. There's the business side of things and there's the non-business side of things. So when you're working as a professional, when you're running a business, you really need to think about the business-related social media use. So if your business has a social media page where you're communicating with your patients and your clients, that's your business work-related social media. You then have a professional's non-work-related use. So anything you do in your private time on your own social media accounts that you may not share with patients, it's important to understand that can still impact you as a professional. Both types of social media use can have both a negative and a positive impact on your business and on you as an individual. So we're going to go into some examples here, looking at both those business-related social media posts where sometimes things have gone wrong, and also some of those non-work-related areas where things have gone wrong. So the first two examples I've got here, one is from BlackBerry. So this is a little bit of an old post. I'm not even sure if BlackBerry are making phones anymore. I think they still exist doing some other things. But back in the day, BlackBerry was a really key competitor with iPhones because they were one of the first phones to get into the professional market. So a lot of people's first work phone, once we got rid of pages, was a BlackBerry. So BlackBerry sent out this post saying, keep up the conversation, use your BlackBerry to share information. If you look closely down the bottom, which I've expanded there for you, it was actually sent via Twitter using an iPhone. So somebody at BlackBerry used their iPhone to promote the use of BlackBerries. So not a significant problem, but it is one of those examples, I suppose, that shows you if you're not mindful of what it is you're doing and how you're using things, it's one of those things that can go a bit public, as this clearly has, because I've managed to find it online. This has gone public and really just made BlackBerry look a bit silly. Now, the next one beside it from Gap, this is one that's a lot more, I guess, more serious. That isn't one you can laugh off the way you could laugh off the BlackBerry one. So in this particular case, this was a number of years ago now, there was Hurricane Sandy, which happened on the east coast of the United States, impacted the United States, the states on the east coast of that country, but also impacted a lot of your Caribbean nations as well. It caused huge devastation. It caused a significant loss of life. Gap is quite a big retailer in North America, sells a lot of clothes and lots of other sort of merchandise. They've tweeted during the hurricane, notice out to all those impacted by Hurricane Sandy, please stay safe. We'll be doing lots of online shopping today. How about you? So they were heavily criticised when they put this out there, criticised for using really quite a catastrophic moment where people were losing their lives and their homes and just using that as a moment to encourage people to go shopping. So you can see this tweet underneath it where they've had to apologise because of the backlash that they received and I guess kind of apologise, but also kind of come up with an excuse that they were just encouraging you to stay safe, but it really didn't read in that way, as you can imagine. They actually weren't the only retailer to try to, I guess you could say, cash in during that period. There were quite a few that were offering special deals just for those in the states on the east coast of the United States where they could get particular deals if they lived in those states. There were others that were saying often when you shop online, if you put in a particular code, you can get a discount. Some had like a code of, hashtag Sandy and you'd get a particular discount. So some really not particularly appropriate use, I guess, of social media and not a particularly appropriate way of communicating with customers. And they did receive that feedback. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is a recent one from LD, only a couple of years ago, I think it was. This is a bit of an interesting one, which I'm not sure whether LD saw what could have gone wrong or didn't see what could have gone wrong. So they've posted this. This is an interesting use of social media where business actually asks for interaction from their customers. That can work really well for them, depending on the depending on the interaction and the comments they get. As you can see, what they've asked you to do there is, the line is, I became an LD lover when I tasted something for the first time. So I'm sure you can imagine there were some genuine comments in there. There were maybe some silly ones, but there were also some pretty crass and vulgar comments that they were given as well. When I first saw this one, I thought, what was LD thinking? Surely they must have known this had the potential to turn bad with a statement like that. Which then made me wonder, I wonder if they did think this could go bad, but they think maybe that's going to give them some publicity, that it won't all be bad. Here we are talking about them now. That old idea of no publicity is bad publicity. I don't know. Who knows what they were actually thinking? Whether they saw it could go bad, but that could be good for us. If they didn't see how that could go bad, I really question and wonder about that too, because to me it's fairly obvious. Some people will get into the spirit of this. Some people will take it in quite an inappropriate way. And when that's going then public on your social media accounts, you need to think about how you're going to handle that, because for some people, they might have had a laugh at some of those inappropriate comments. For some people, they could have been quite offended seeing some of the information that was popping up. And LD would have really had to be thinking about how are they managing those comments, removing them, responding to them before it gets out of hand and they're going to potentially getting some other complaints. So it's a little bit of an interesting one. The next one is one I want to show you that came to us at Guild Insurance. So this is where we had a defamation allegation resulting from Facebook use. So what happened was an employee left a workplace, set up their own business somewhere else. So a little bit in competition with where they'd been employed. It wasn't the owner of the business, but one of their employees who had access to posting on their Facebook account wrote a fairly lengthy post criticising that professional and that work person, that former employee, criticising them both on a personal level but also on a professional level, and asked for their current clients to not leave them and not go and follow that other person to their new business. Interestingly, they signed it off from the owner of the business, not from them who actually wrote it. And the owner of the business didn't actually see that post before it went public. Not surprisingly, this particular ex-employee who saw this, that person was named. They were actually understandably quite disgruntled with this, quite unhappy, and they did take legal action alleging they were defamed because of this. So this is one, I remember when I read the post, it was very interesting to read in that, in a way, it seemed well thought out. It was fairly lengthy. A lot of information went into it. They didn't write it quickly. I think they really did take some time with the post because it was quite lengthy. But what I don't think they did was stop and think about the implications of the post. So they put a lot of thought into the content, but they didn't think about the implications of that content. And when you read that information and read that particular post, it's really no surprise that that particular professional was unhappy with what was said about them, and no surprise they took action. So they really didn't have that proper stop and think, not just about what they're posting, but how it will come back to them. Now I'm going to move on now to some examples of what can go wrong when people are posting on their personal accounts. Before I do that, I just want to give you a warning that the next ones I'm going to be showing you, it uses some pretty inappropriate and really quite disgusting language. So the reason I'm showing you the next one, this was a nurse who was based in Broome, who was posted not on his own Facebook page, but on a community Facebook page for the area of Broome. He's made some comments that were deemed to be racist, and there's really some quite inappropriate language in there. The reason I want to show you this is, I think when I talk to a lot of professionals, and particularly health professionals who are highly trained and quite regulated, I know I would expect better, and I think a lot of us would. I'm still surprised, and I've seen this post many times when I talk about this, I'm still surprised that a nurse, one, thinks what this person posted, but two, thought it was okay to post on a community page. And this is where I really encourage you to think about
not just what you post, but what any of your colleagues may post when they're Friday night at the pub drinking with their mates, for example. I'm sure this person's employer, which was a hospital in Broome, I'm assuming that they were really quite stunned and very disappointed in this post. So I do apologise that this language is quite inappropriate, but I do think because it is an Australian-based nurse, it is important to have a look at this and reflect on it and think about what sometimes people do post, much to our surprise. So as you can see, there are two comments there of what he's actually said. I'm not going to repeat the language in there. You can read them yourself. The reason it was deemed to be racist language, well, he hasn't mentioned anything specific or obvious in there about race, but his comment about bull bars, this was up in Broome. There had been a teenager, a 14-year-old boy, who was killed when he was hit by a ute that had a bull bar on the front. And it was an Indigenous boy, and the thinking, there were different views on it, but there was thinking in the community that it was an intentional thing, that he was chased down by someone in a ute, knocked off his bike, or a motorbike, I think it was, and he was killed. And obviously that bull bar did a lot of damage. So that's where the racist thoughts, I guess, came from, why they think this was a racist comment, not where he hasn't clearly mentioned Indigenous people in there. You can see from his comment underneath where he's apologised for his comments. He's referred to being intoxicated. I think a lot of us would think that doesn't make things okay if he's willing to say this when intoxicated. Personally, I would wonder what he thinks when he's not intoxicated, because I don't think alcohol generally makes us racist. So no surprise that he did lose his job for that particular rant. So as you can see, imagine living in a fairly small community such as Broome, where a lot of people know other people. To see one of your nurses make a comment like this is really quite horrible, quite appalling, and I think a lot of us would be quite surprised to see that. The next one I'm going to show you is from a nurse in the US, still inappropriate, but not quite to that same level. So this nurse was working in ICU, obviously having a bit of a quiet night, as you would probably hope if you're in ICU, but she said, "Getting so sleepy here." I'm sorry, I've got lights going off in this room because I'm in a room with sensor lights. I do apologise for that. Okay, back on. So as she said, "So sleepy here in the ICU, will someone please code and give me something to do?" So kind of asking for her patients to have some sort of serious event where she needs to actually do some work. Now, I'm sure most of us would read that thinking, I'm sure she doesn't actually want her patients to die. Most people would never think that sort of way, but it's still an inappropriate comment to make, particularly when you're in an important position such as a nurse. Patients, the families and friends of patients in there will potentially see that. What often happens is information then goes back to the nurse, back to the employer, particularly when she has actually gone and mentioned where it is she's working. She's named the medical centre, and she did lose her job. So it really is important to understand that impact on you as a professional, even when you're tweeting or posting on whatever sort of a page it is, doing it outside of work time, it can come back to haunt you, I guess, and there can be quite serious ramifications. Even if you're just a post like this where you think it's just a bit of a silly, funny post, only my friends are going to see it, I'm not particularly famous, and think it doesn't matter too much, but it does. So often when we talk about people's employment being impacted, and particularly people losing their job, there's often a lot of questions about, is that fair? Is that appropriate? Should we lose our job for something we've done outside of work? Can we separate personal and professional? Now, I'm not a lawyer. I can't comment on the legalities of it, but what I will do is give you an example here on screen now. So in this particular case, and this is just one example, I'm not saying this is going to set some sort of precedent, but this is just one example where someone has tried to separate their personal and professional use of social media and behaviour. So this was in a regional city in Victoria, a fairly large city north of Melbourne that is quite large, and a mosque was being built there. There was some opposition, unfortunately, to the mosque, and this particular councillor, she was opposed, and she used her personal Twitter account, so not her council Twitter account. She used her then Twitter account to send some really derogatory and offensive comments to a woman who was supporting the development. And I did read, and I won't post them here or mention them, but the comments and the images she shared were really quite vulgar and disgusting. She had on her Twitter account that her opinions were hers only, her personal opinions, and didn't represent the council. And she claimed that the only time she was acting as a councillor was when she was present at council meetings. So in her views, what she did outside of those council times and those council meetings was her time alone and shouldn't be seen as one and the same and shouldn't be sort of put together. However, there were complaints about her post, and this went to VCAT, which is the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal in Victoria, and there is a similar legal process in all states around the country. She was found guilty of misconduct under the Local Government Act, and she was reprimanded. And the judge stated that the disclaimer didn't protect her from taking responsibility for her words. So it is an interesting example of someone who has tried to create that separation, but it wasn't successful. Now, when you do some research online of people who have lost their jobs because of social media use, you'll find some interesting and varying results. So I don't think we can say what happens in most situations. I've seen some cases where people have lost their work because of what they've done in their own time. This has gone to their, they've put in some sort of complaint, so it might be like to Fair Work Australia or someone like that, and they've had their position reinstated. But in other cases, the dismissal has been upheld and they haven't got their job back. So it is varying, different things happen. But what I think is really important to understand is you cannot keep your personal and professional life separate when you're using social media, whether that's fair, whether that's right, whether that's ethical. We could debate that all day, but that is just what happens. So you do just need to be very mindful of that. What I'm going to be talking about now is what I refer to as officially the public response to tweets and posts, but what I'll also refer to as a little bit of a pile-on is the way I see it. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes when people use social media, and this can happen to people in very public settings, so people who are quite well known, whether they're famous celebrities or whether we're talking people such as politicians or journalists, but it can also happen to people like you and I, where somehow it's spread really quite far and much further than you would have thought. And a lot of people have come on there to criticise and almost attack. And that's why I refer to it as a bit of a pile-on, where sometimes the response gets a little bit out of hand. So only last year, Australia appointed what was an ambassador for gender equality. Her name was Stephanie Copus-Campbell. She posted a video on Twitter last year introducing herself and the role that she'll be undertaking in that role of ambassador for gender equality. There were a lot of criticisms of the video. A lot of the criticisms became incredibly unfair, talking about the way she looked, the way she spoke. There were criticisms of her eyes, and it really became quite nasty and incredibly personal. It's one of those things, if people had differing views on whether that role is necessary or the way that role was going to be used and how it would happen, that's one thing when it's making comments about sort of professional roles within Australia, but it became incredibly personal and incredibly critical. What was really bizarre was how wide the criticism was. So we had Liberal Party president making some really quite nasty comments, but bizarrely, even Donald Trump Jr. was getting in on things and criticising it, which I thought was quite bizarre that he would see that and that he would have views on that. So this is an example of just how far things can go. Now, this particular woman was in some sort of public role. She's not particularly well known, but it was a new public role as part of the federal government. The next example I'm going to give you is a woman who is not famous at all, and I'm sure is still completely surprised at just how far her post went and the criticism that she received. So this particular woman, Lindsay Stone, as you can see the photo on the left, Lindsay Stone had a bit of an ongoing joke with a friend where they would take photos in front of signs, sort of doing the opposite or mocking the sign. So that old thing of standing in front of a no standing zone and you're standing in front of something saying no standing. This particular one says silence and respect. And as you can see, she's pretending to shout, so not silent, and she's pretending to not show respect by giving the finger. For those who, I'm not sure if you can read it clearly on screen there, but she's at Arlington National Cemetery in the United States. For those who may not be aware, Arlington National Cemetery is a very revered special cemetery for a lot of people in the United States. There are many ex-presidents buried there, and there's also a lot of military personnel buried there. So it holds a lot of significance for a lot of people in that country. When she took this photo, she posted it on Facebook, just her own personal page. She was there for a work event, so a work setting, a work excursion. So she worked at a disability support service for people with learning difficulties. So she'd taken her clients there for the day, saw this sign, took a photo just to share with her friends on Facebook. Another example of her sort of mocking those signs and doing the opposite of what's in the signs. A few friends said, yeah, probably not ideal, maybe take it down, but she didn't bother. that thinking of, I'm not famous, no one's really going to see it, it probably doesn't really matter. Important to keep in mind that once you put something out there on social media, it's very easy to spread and share with lots of other people, and you can never really take it down. While she might have been able to remove the actual post, once someone has screenshotted it and shared it in other places, or just forwarded on, just depending on what platform they're using, you can't take down all of those. They're out there and they never go. If you Google Lindsay Stone now, you will still find this information. So it is out there forever. So much to her surprise and shock, I'm sure, a Fire Lindsay Stone Facebook page was created and it received thousands and thousands of likes. She did lose her job. She was accused of disrespecting the military. She also received death threats and rape threats. So this is where I say it's a little bit of a pile-on. Losing her job, I guess, is one level, and some might say that's appropriate considering what she did whilst out on a work activity and a work excursion. But death threats and rape threats are obviously a whole other level of inappropriate behaviour. But this is that example, as I said, the pile-on that can happen on social media is really quite disturbing at times. Now, while this particular case is not common, it's just another time, I think, another example to really stop and reflect on what it is we do on social media and how easily it can sometimes for some people just turn out of control. If you search for these sorts of examples, there's quite a few out there that are in the public domain where you can see that someone just hasn't thought through their post, they've shared something. All that needs to happen sometimes is if someone sees it and is quite offended, and if they send it to a particular famous blogger, someone who's got quite a large presence on social media, once they get hold of it and they start to share it to their huge following, that's when things happen. A lot of people will read it, maybe not like it, but they might be offended, but they might ignore it. It's really quite common now, though, for people to find this person, find how to get in touch with them, or find their place of employment and demand that they lose their job. I think what becomes unfortunate for a lot of workplaces is they might battle between, look, we don't agree with what they did, but we don't think they need to lose their job. However, if that starts to impact that place of employment in terms of their partnerships, their sponsorships, and if they're receiving some backlash, often they will, you could say, cave into that potentially, and they do sack the person because they need to, for them to look after themselves and their reputation. So it's a bit of an unfortunate flow on, and as you can see, that's why I describe the public response as unfortunately that sort of pile on, and it becomes much bigger than anyone would have anticipated. So as I said, unlikely that you will face these sorts of things, but when we're talking about social media risks, we just need to think broadly about potentially what can happen. So moving on now to your responses on social media. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do we respond to any sort of negative posts or negative feedback on social media? This is a really hard question to answer, and there's no one right answer. But I've got an example there on screen for you from David Jones where they probably didn't respond in quite the most appropriate way. So I'm not going to read that whole post to you, but a particular woman this woman has got online, given David Jones some feedback that she wasn't happy with their catalogue, largely because the colour of the people who were in the catalogue, she took, I'm not sure if the word offence is right, but she wasn't impressed that they'd used some black models. In her eyes, she thought she couldn't relate to that, and she didn't think many people she knew could relate to that. David Jones has responded to that by thanking her for her feedback and saying they'd pass that feedback on to their marketing department for their consideration. Now, probably, I think not surprisingly, David Jones was then the one who really copped a lot of criticism, not just that woman, because I think a lot of people saw this as an opportunity for David Jones to really shut down those sorts of comments and say, make some sort of statement along the lines of, we don't agree with your comments on this. We are happy to use diversity within our models and our employees to represent the diversity within Australian community, something along those lines. Instead, their post back almost looks like they're giving some sort of true acknowledgement and reflection on this person's particular comments. I do wonder if their reply back was either someone who wasn't particularly well trained in social media and had a bit of a standard reply to everyone in terms of a thank you for your response, we'll take that on board. I don't even know if it was an automated response. I don't know if you could do that in Facebook. It did make me wonder, what was their process in terms of when they read that information? Did they really stop and reflect and think about How should we respond in this particular situation compared to how we respond for other types of comments and feedback? So I'd really encourage you to not have one type of response to all sorts of feedback and really think about how you will respond. Now, again, you're not nearly as big as David Jones when you're running your businesses, so you're not going to have the same sort of criticism. But it is important to keep in mind that if someone gives you some negative feedback on what's a sort of public page, so if you do have a business page for your, a social media page for your business, if someone makes a negative comment there, it's possible that some of your other patients and clients will see those comments. And then if you're responding back to them, they can potentially see that as well. So it can be seen by a few people. There's a few options in terms of how do you respond. Things such as, I've got a few options there on screen for you, and there's probably a few other options as well too. You can ignore the post. Some things probably deserve to just be ignored, but that could annoy some people and they might then come back again a little bit more angry, a little bit more aggressive potentially. You can delete it. If you think that information is particularly offensive and you just don't want it on your particular social media page, you might consider deleting it so other people don't see that information. Sometimes you might consider contacting the person away from social media. What you can do sometimes in those circumstances is maybe just acknowledge their comment or their feedback and just say that we'll take this offline and I will contact you separately. So it's not ignoring, but it's not getting into any kind of conversation or online discussion in that public space where others can see it. Do you let them know you disagree with them or do you not? You know, this is something that I think became quite interesting during the same-sex marriage debate back, I think it was 2017 now, in Australia. There were quite a lot of companies who were coming out boldly supporting the same-sex marriage vote and were in favour of it. And they were being quite clear in their advertising that this is something they wanted to support. Quite often when you followed that on social media, there was then people who didn't agree with them who were writing some negative comments, not too, I guess, dissimilar to in a different way, but sort of, I guess, what this particular comment here on screen says, where they're saying, not happy with what you've posted, don't agree. There was a lot of, I don't like you getting into this. This has got nothing to do with your business. I don't want to support your business anymore. Some of those companies, often very large companies that I guess are already very successful and have clear sort of communication and marketing strategies, they played into that and they would often make some sort of jokes about, well, fine, see you later, we're not going to miss you, those sorts of things. Easy for bigger companies to do, and if that's the, I guess, the strategy they want to take. However, sometimes for smaller businesses, saying you disagree with someone can become a little bit dangerous if you're going to get into a bit of a heated online discussion that other people can see. So there's different ways of doing it. It can work, it can also backfire. Thanking them for their feedback. Now, this is what David Jones did. They thanked them for their feedback, but there might be times where you don't actually want to thank them for their feedback. If their comments are inappropriate, if they're offensive in some way, if you thank them and your other patients see that you've thanked them, it might offend some of those other patients. So I would love to tell you how to respond to negative posts, but there isn't one way. You really need to have a think about for your individual business, for what it is that you offer, for your patients, for your reputation, I guess, and the brand that you've tried to create for your business. You need to think about what's best for you and how you want to interact online and what you want to use that social media account for. Just do think about whatever you do on social media in reply to these negative posts and feedback, other people may see it. So just keep in mind, you might be happy if you don't solve things for that particular patient, because you might be happy for them to not come back to your place of business. But keep in mind that other patients who you do want to keep might see that information and those comments and that interaction. So just think about when you're replying, when you're acknowledging, think about how is this going to look for other people who potentially could see it. Okay, moving along. Okay, so we're heading into the last few sections of this webinar for you today. As I said, I'm going to finish with some really practical tips that you can take away that you can think about both for your personal and professional social media use. So first one, for those who are AHPRA registered, but also for those who aren't, I would recommend all of you go onto the AHPRA website. There's a link there. They don't have a particular document, so it's not like the Code of Conduct where they've got a document you can download, but they just have a page on their website that they refer to as social media guidance. They give some tips on things you should and shouldn't say and do and shouldn't do on social media. Even for those who aren't registered by, regulated by AHPRA, I would still recommend you go on there, because I think for any health professional, It's just some good information to think about and reflect on. If you are using social media for your business, have a think about why and how. Don't just do it because it's 2024 and everyone else is doing it and you think you should. I don't think social media suits every business. It depends on the nature of the business. I don't expect to get social media pop-ups, Facebook reminders from health professionals who I engage with. I know a lot of health professionals like to use it. I'm not saying don't, it's entirely up to you. But I think social media definitely aligns more, I guess, with some types of businesses a little bit more than other types of businesses. And you also need to make sure that you're using things appropriately because as a health professional, there's other standards we expect of you that we maybe don't quite have of maybe, say, a retail brand. So don't just use it because you think you should. Think about why you're going to use it and how you're going to use it. What's the purpose? How's it going to benefit your business? You need to make any decisions about business social media on business requirements. So if you absolutely love Twitter, for example, which is now X, or if you absolutely love Instagram, that doesn't mean Instagram's right for your business. You might prefer for business to use Facebook, even though you might not like Facebook socially and personally. So think about what's good for the business, not just what do you like doing on social media, but what will benefit your business. I really encourage you, even if you're a small business, even if you're a small solo practitioner, think about developing some guidelines about who should be posting, what should you be posting, how often, and monitoring them. And how often those posts were monitored and posts from your patients. The reason I encourage you to develop these guidelines is this gives you a moment to stop and reflect on what it is you're doing. If you have colleagues, what are your colleagues doing? And come up with a process that's going to be working for you. As I said, even if you're a sole practitioner, developing these guidelines will give you a chance to think about for yourself and jot down this information for yourself. So you've sort of got some rules in place to remind yourself how often you're going to go check the social media pages, what are you going to be posting, so you're not just kind of using it in an ad hoc, unplanned, messy kind of way. Have a clear process. This guideline doesn't have to be a big document, but it's just about giving yourself that stop and reflect and plan moment to think about if you're using social media, how and why, what's it for, what are you going to be posting. When I talk about how often social media pages are monitored and by who, this is beneficial for a number of reasons, but it's also about thinking back to how do you respond and reflect on those negative comments. If someone has posted something that's a criticism, or they may have just asked a question about your business, and if you don't go back and respond to them, that's the same as not picking up your mobile phone or your office phone if someone calls. If you have a phone number, people expect you to answer the phone or call them back. If you have a social media page, people expect their comments are going to be seen. So if you choose to have a social media page, do make sure you go on and check it, because if people are posting comments, questions, criticisms, whatever it might be, they want that information seen. My fifth point there is to consider either some training or getting external support to use social media for your business. This can be helpful because you might just be too busy to do it well. It might not be something you are too overly familiar with and you don't know how to do it nicely, other than just putting up some text comments. If you wanted some images or sort of nice things done in a little bit more of a nice sort of interesting way, you might want that external help. The challenge here, though, is you need to make sure you're totally across what they create, and you need to make sure you're approving it. We do see businesses get into trouble when they just leave things to that social media external company, I guess it is, and a type of marketing company or an advertising company. If you just leave everything to them and you're not across it, this is where you could get into a little bit of trouble if they post something that's maybe not particularly appropriate for a health professional. It could actually conflict with AHPRA's expectations of you as well. So just make sure you're across what it is they do. Don't leave it to them blindly. Just use them for that support. Next few tips here. Consider what messages you're going to be using social media for, and always make sure you're adhering to both AHPRA's social media guidelines, but also their advertising requirements. So back to that point where I talked about using external people, this is where it can become a bit of an issue if they don't understand advertising requirements, or for yourselves, if you're posting your own information, if you're not thoroughly across your advertising requirements. We do see cases where people are breaching those advertising requirements because of what they're posting on social media. So be really careful about what it is you post, making sure you're understanding those other professional requirements in terms of your professional behaviour and conduct, and make sure you're not breaching those. I think the challenge with social media is it sometimes encourages those quick, short messages where you don't often stop and reflect and proofread and think about. And that's where people can often get into trouble. So which leads nicely into that point number 7. So when you're posting on social media, think about how people might interpret but also misinterpret those messages. Think back to some of those earlier ones, the woman standing in front of the sign at the cemetery. Again, I'm making an assumption, but I'm quite certain she didn't mean to offend people. She was just making a joke of the sign about that information about, you know, being respectful and being silent. That was all she was meaning to mock, and it went much further than she expected. So think about how people could interpret and misinterpret that information. Very important not to post in haste. So I mentioned a moment ago, social media really encourages that, particularly now that we all have, most of us would have now smartphones in our hands of some sort, or tablets. Years ago, I remember when I first started using social media, you'd have to get out your computer and log on and log into that particular social media account. Now you can just pick up your phone, type in a message, hit send or hit post, and it's out there to the world in an instant. This is where I think business and social media can become a bit messy, because we're often not being encouraged to stop and think, whereas that's incredibly important from a business perspective. Privacy rules. The privacy rules that you're expected to adhere to as a professional, as a health professional, these apply equally on social media. So don't relax those ideas. Anything you wouldn't do or say in your clinic setting, you can't do or say on social media. So make sure you're adhering to those, knowing nothing changes. Very important to understand the platform you're using. As we mentioned at the start of this session, those platforms change, they grow, they develop, they change their settings, they operate in different ways. You need to make sure you're staying across those, make sure you understand how they work, make sure you understand how information can be shared once you've posted it, because it can go much further than you've intended. And my last screen here, just want that to jump over, there we go. Last screen here of tips. We've talked about this already. You cannot separate your personal and professional social media use. So I do use social media personally. I have my own Facebook page that I do use for personal reasons, and I don't post about work, but I'm very mindful when I post on there. I'm still the risk services manager at Guild Insurance, and I need to be incredibly mindful of what I post that can still reflect on me, who I am professionally. Be very careful if you're using social media for obtaining professional information. So what I mean by this is, one way that social media has been great is by encouraging people to come together and share information, support each other, give each other assistance and guidance and things like that. And it's quite common to see professional networking groups that are often closed groups where people come in just to share information within their profession. And people often go on there with some questions looking for advice. Whilst there are some clear benefits to doing that, you really need to think about who is giving you this advice. If you're posting a question into a particular social group, and someone comes back to you with an answer, are you sure they've got that correct? Really think about who's giving you information. And this is why I really encourage you, when you're looking for professional advice, stick to those professional services, such as your association, your regulator, other people who you know have that position of responsibility and authority and know things, and they're going to get that information right. Don't just listen to anyone giving you guidance because they're on social media. The same as if you were sitting there in person with some other people in your profession, you might be questioning what they tell you. It's the same as online. Privacy on social media in terms of private groups. There are lots of private groups on social media where you can only get into that group if someone gives you permission. Unfortunately, people let their guard down when they're in those private groups. We've seen some defamation allegations come out of those where someone has posted something negative about someone else within their profession. You don't need to be particularly tech savvy to take a screenshot and share that further. And next thing you know, that particular person you criticised has seen that information and they're taking defamation, some sort of legal action alleging that they've been defamed. There is no such thing as privacy on social media. A private group just means you can't get in there till someone lets you in. It's not private. They'll let a lot of people in and a lot of information can sneak out of there as well. So please don't let your guard down because you see the word private. Number 14, when we talk about being friends or connecting, depending on what the platform it is you're talking about, but connecting with your patients on social media. Now, I haven't been able to find with a number of the regulators some really clear information saying do not do it. They more just talk about be careful, be mindful of it. I know that for some of you who may be working in some fairly small, rural, remote communities, sometimes it's hard to not be friends online with your patients, because sometimes your patients are people you know because you might be the only one of your profession in that town. So sometimes that can blow those boundaries already for you, which is a little bit of a challenge. However, if you have a patient who is only your patient and you met them as a patient and you have no other interactions with them, unless you have a business page, I would say do not connect with them on social media. It's one thing for them to follow your business page because that is your advertising, your promotion of your business and your services. But don't have your patients follow your private page. It starts to blur those professional boundaries. You're there to be their health professional. You're not there to be their friend. And it just starts to get a bit messy. They're going to see all the family photos. They're going to know when you're taking holidays and where you're going. They don't need and they shouldn't need to see that information. So just make sure you keep that separation between you and your patients. And the final point there on screen. Many years ago when I started using social media, I remember people said, if you don't want your grandma knowing something, don't put on social media, which looking back is quite odd because my grandparents definitely didn't use social media. However, the message was there to sort of emphasize, I guess, that if you're using social media, people who you didn't intend to see that information can see that information because it can be shared. So my message to you as a professional, if there is something that you wouldn't say to a patient, colleague, competitor, regulator, insurance company, I would encourage you to not put it on social media because it can be screenshotted, shared, and I'm sorry, the lights have just gone out on me again. There you go. Please don't put anything on social media if you don't want anyone out there to see it, because whilst it might not be likely that anyone out there will see it, it can happen though. So just to wrap up now, I've just got a little bit of a funny screenshot here of quite an interesting article that I found a couple of years ago. So this is now getting quite old now. I found it about 10 years ago. It was written almost 30 years ago. This was written by an academic who wrote an article about basically why the internet's not going to work. It's not going to happen. It's not going to take off. When I first read it, I thought it was satire because a lot of his criticism of the internet is actually a reality for us now. He talks about the lack of quality control, the fact that anyone can post any sort of information and we don't know if it's true or it's accurate or where it actually comes from. Unfortunately, 30 years later, that is still an issue for us. But where the article was quite interesting, he talked about his thoughts that this just won't take off. People are not going to book holidays online. We're not going to have the internet going to classrooms. We're not going to read books online. Everything he said we wouldn't do, we do. And when I first found this 10 years ago, because it was only 20 years, around about 20 years after it was written, it was really interesting for me to reflect on just how quickly the internet and particularly then social media has grown and just taken up such a huge part of our lives. Whereas back in the mid-90s, for those of us who remember the mid-90s, we just didn't use the internet. And it took quite a few years, I think, even well into sort of the late 90s into the early 2000s, till people were using it fairly frequently. But then to the point where people are using it daily, whereas now most of us probably don't get through the first half hour of our day without using the internet in some way, shape or form. Maybe not social media, but you might go on to read the news or just check the weather before you go for a morning walk, whatever it might be. So it's just a funny article. I've got the web link there, but you can also just Google why the web won't be Nirvana. It's just a funny article, particularly for those of us, as I said, who remember the mid-90s, to just reflect on how quickly this has changed. It's a reminder of, whilst there are some amazing things that the internet gives us, it's also not perfect and it does create some risk for us as well. And hopefully you have a bit of a laugh reading that article as I did. So wrapping up now, I've just got some contact details for you there on screen. The email address is my direct email address. I'm happy to take some questions now. However, if there is anything that you don't think of now or you have some questions you would like to ask afterwards in private, whether it be about risk management or anything else we do here at Guild Insurance, please feel free to get in touch with me directly. There's also the website there and the direct number for Guild Insurance, our contact number, sorry. The last email, web link I have there, riskhq.com.au. This is a risk management website that is run by Guild Insurance. You can go on there and find a range of different articles on things like social media, but a range of different risk articles as well. We've got things there about advertising, about complaints management, a range of different things. So I would encourage you to go on there, look up some free information that will help you in your practice. So thank you so much for joining today. As I said, I really hope that all of you have taken at least one tip that you're going to go away, think about, apply to your social media use, whether that be your business or your personal, and think about some changes that you can make. Now, I'm happy to take some questions now if there are any. Okay, I can see there's quite a few. Just bear with me for a moment. Does Guild provide coverage for social media? That depends on what, because social media is a broad term, it depends on what we're saying in terms of social media use. So if someone's posting about things that have got nothing to do with their professional setting, their professional work, it possibly won't be covered. If it's maybe linked to their advertising of their business and that then there's been an allegation that their advertising has been in breach of the advertising guidelines, that's where something might be covered. So it's always hard, unfortunately, with insurance to say, yes, we will or no, we won't cover. It does very much with social media depend on what the social media post or information is about and if that's something that would be covered by what is a professional indemnity policy. Important to keep in mind, professional indemnity policy is there to cover you for incidents or accidents or mistakes that happen whilst carrying out your professional practice. So if you're making some really inappropriate comments on a Friday night over drinks, then most likely not the sort of stuff that would be covered. It has to relate to what you do as a professional. So comment here, can you please reiterate the advertising requirements for health professionals? A little bit difficult to go into that now. Maybe this is some information I can work with your association to get out there for you all, because it is important to understand. What I would explain though, for anyone who is registered with AHPRA, it is a requirement you adhere to their advertising guidelines and they are written in international law. I encourage you to go to the AHPRA website. In their search function, just type in advertising or advertising hub. They actually have a section of their website called Advertising Hub where there's a lot of information about the do's and don'ts, but particularly go to a document called Guidelines for Advertising. So it goes through all the information about what it is you can and can't do in your advertising. Incredibly important to make sure you're adhering to that because it is written international law. So please do make yourselves aware. If you're not yet aware of those, yeah, incredibly important that you do understand those requirements. So next question, am I right in thinking that as a health professional, we are not supposed to have patient references on a social media platform? I think when you, if this question is referring to, when you say patient reference, excuse me, when we say patient references, I'm assuming we're talking about feedback, so things like testimonials. So that is one thing that does sit under the AHPRA advertising guidelines. Testimonials are banned for AHPRA registered professionals. So you can't have any positive feedback, comments, anything where they're promoting your business. If something does go onto your social media page where someone is giving you positive feedback, so a testimonial, you need to make sure you're taking that off your social media page. If that information is posted somewhere that you don't have control over, such as Google reviews, you're not expected to remove it, but you're expected to ignore it. So where we do see sometimes people going wrong is they use their social media to post what someone has posted somewhere else. You can't link those two. So yes, if you're talking about testimonials, any sort of references, promotion of you coming from a patient, that is banned under AHPRA's advertising guidelines. Next question, what red flags to look out for when patient is nudging towards a friendship? Look, this can be really quite broad. I guess sometimes trust your gut, trust your instinct, trust, I guess, that those red flags that are going off in your mind. Think about the sorts of comments and questions coming from the patient. It's okay to have conversations between any sort of health practitioner and a patient that are on that low-level personal interaction. So how's your day going? How's your weekend? You know, how was the holiday you recently took? If they start asking a bit more about where you live or your children or your partner, so those sorts of comments become a little bit more personal, there's some of the red flags that you might be considering. If they ask to connect with you on a personal social media page, then there's definitely a red flag. Sometimes you can just decline, but sometimes health professionals actually get to a situation where they actually just need to explain, look, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend you, but it is an expectation of me as a health professional. We do have to maintain a boundary here. So I really can't connect with you on social media, or no, look, I'm sorry, you know, happy birthday, but I really can't join your Friday night drinks for your birthday because we do have to just maintain this professional boundary. It is expected of me. You know, I am here to treat you and not be your friend, so I do apologise. If it goes too far, I do know of health professionals that have been asked out in a romantic setting by patients. When it goes to that other level, really making you feel uncomfortable and you think they're maybe not taking those other sort of lower level comments or rejections on board, sometimes you do need to then look at ending that therapeutic relationship and not treat them anymore, because you don't want to get yourself into that uncomfortable situation where you are breaching boundaries, where they have done or said something that's really going to make you uncomfortable and put you in an unprofessional situation. So it's broad how you deal with it. As I said, trust how you feel. You can end that treating relationship if you are feeling too uncomfortable with those particular patients. Next question, what protection advice can we access if someone defames us as a professional on social media? Look, this is a little bit challenging. This is where your professional indemnity policy generally won't come into play. Your professional indemnity policy is there to protect you when someone makes an allegation of wrongdoing against you in your professional workplace and what you're doing as a professional. It's not there to support you if you were to take some sort of legal action against someone else. Professional indemnity policies aren't there to provide that protection there. So you would potentially, if you think you need to, or if you want to go down this path, you could look at seeking some independent legal advice if you think you need to. It's really about weighing up how much do you think you can maybe just ignore that comment? Is it really going to impact you? I know for myself, sometimes when I see negative comments about professionals or businesses online, sometimes I get the feeling when I read them, look, this person's really being unreasonable. If I know I like this particular restaurant or health professional or whoever it might be, I'm not going to worry about what that person has said because I think they're being a little bit unfair, unrealistic, demanding. So sometimes you need to balance, is it worth fighting it? Is it worth just ignoring it? There's no one answer again. This is something you need to really balance out. If you do think it has impacted you significantly in terms of running your business and impacted your reputation, then you can look at seeking some legal advice. The challenge is sometimes, this is something that gets talked about a lot in terms of social media. To get information taken down and removed isn't easy, unfortunately. These are quite large corporations we're dealing with when we talk about social media. So it's one thing to take action in terms of if you have suffered some sort of harm from that defamation, but in terms of removing posts, unfortunately, it becomes a little bit challenging. So there are some options out there, but it's unfortunately not easy. So it's something you need to really weigh up for yourself. The next question, can we have client testimonials on your website? So as mentioned, for those who are AHPRA registered, no, you can't. If you're not AHPRA registered, look, the guidance is often recommended, I guess, for all health professionals to consider adhering to AHPRA requirements because it really is about setting best standard. So for anyone AHPRA registered, no, you can't have those testimonials on your page. They are banned. There was talk about 2 years ago, I think, where it was proposed they might remove that as an exclusion. That didn't happen. Testimonials are still banned. As I mentioned, that means you can't also stretch that out a little bit. You can't have a link to Google reviews on your website because that's still linking through to testimonials. So on your website, on your social media pages, anywhere where you advertise your business, you can't use testimonials according to AHPRA's guidelines. That looks to be all the questions I can see. Just seeing if any more have popped up the top. I don't believe there are any more. So look, if there's no more questions, as I said, there's my direct email address on screen now. So you are welcome to get in touch with me if you think of something after this session. Thank you for those questions. Thank you for joining us. Good luck with your social media, and I look forward to speaking to you again next time. Take care. Goodbye.